Original context. The story begins with a Vietnamese greeting and introduces to Vin, a boy born into poverty, facing harsh conditions from birth, and his father to Dung's dedication despite their struggles. Americanized adaptation. Welcome to my channel, folks. I'm Tracy Nguyen, your storyteller spinning yarns of American folklore, unsolved mysteries, and quirky tales. Today we're diving into the story of Tommy Vaughn, a kid who started life with the odds stacked against him. Tommy Vaughn came from humble roots, born to a struggling family in a small Appalachian town. His mom brought him into the world on a bitter December night, the kind where the wind howls through the hills and the frost bites deep. Back then they didn't have much, no thick blankets, no central heating, just a rickety old cabin barely holding together. The cold sank into Tommy's bones from day one, and it left him frail, sickly even. For years, he was stuck in bed, too weak to run around like other kids. His dad, Duke Vaughn, was a rough-around-the-edges kind of guy, think flannel shirts, calloused hands, and a voice that could scare off a bear. But Duke had a soft spot for his boy. With Tommy's mom gone early, Duke took on everything, working odd jobs at the lumber mill, cooking watery oatmeal, spoon-feeding Tommy when he couldn't lift a hand. It wasn't pretty, but Duke kept them afloat, scraping by on grit and a stubborn streak a mile wide. By the time Tommy hit 3, something wild happened. Duke stumbled into a windfall, won a small chunk of cash from a scratch-off ticket at the gas station. For once, they had a little breathing room. That summer, with the sun blazing down, Duke took Tommy to the creek behind their place. They'd sit on the bank, watching the sunset turn the water gold, just a father and son stealing a moment of peace. Original context. To Vin and to Dung encounter a dying snake covered in bees by the river. To Vin's curiosity leads him to help it, despite to Dung's fear, setting the stage for a supernatural reward. Americanized adaptation. So there they were, Duke and little Tommy Vaughn, packing up after a lazy afternoon by the creek, the kind of day where the cicadas hum and the air smells like mud and pine. They were about to head back to their cabin when something caught their eye. Right there on the muddy bank, thrashing weakly, was a rattlesnake, its scales glinting in the fading light. But this wasn't your average rattler. It was swarmed by a buzzing cloud of angry bees, stingers digging into its flesh like it had ticked off the wrong hive. Now, Duke Vaughn was a big guy, 6'2", built like a linebacker, but snakes? They turned him into a nervous wreck. He'd faced down bar fights and broken machinery, but a rattler made his palms sweat. "Tommy, stay back," he barked, scooping the kid up under one arm, ready to bolt. But Tommy, being all of 3 years old and wired with that fearless kid curiosity, squirmed free. Before Duke could grab him, Tommy toddled right over to the snake, wide-eyed and unafraid. Up close, Tommy saw the bees clinging to the snake, relentless. Without a second thought, he started swatting them away with his tiny hands, shooing the swarm like they were just pesky flies. Duke froze, jaw slack, watching his boy take on nature's worst tag team. The bees buzzed off, one by one, until the snake lay there, battered but free. Then, get this, it reared up slow and shaky, and gave a little wiggle of its head and tail, like it was tipping its hat to Tommy. Duke, still rooted to the spot, couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't say a word, just grabbed Tommy's hand and hightailed it home, chalking it up to the weirdest day of his life. That night, Tommy crashed hard after the creek adventure, curled up on his cot under a patched quilt. But his sleep wasn't quiet. In his dream, that same rattlesnake slithered up to him, clear as day, and, "Here's where it gets wild," it talked. "Thank you, little savior," it hissed, voice low and raspy like gravel on a back road. "If you hadn't stepped in, those bees would have been my end, stung me till I was buzzard food. Folks around here say you've got to repay a good deed. So, I'm giving you something special. Take this basin, but listen close, keep doing good, and it'll keep you on the right path." The snake flicked its tail and poof, a puff of greenish smoke swallowed it whole, gone like it had never been there. Tommy jolted awake the next morning, rubbing his eyes, and there it was, an old beat-up copper basin sitting right by his pillow, dented and tarnished like it had been fished out of a junkyard. Tommy Vaughn couldn't contain himself that morning. He scrambled out of bed, snatched the copper basin from beside his pillow, and bolted to the kitchen where Duke was frying up some bacon, about the only luxury they had left from his lottery win. "Dad! Dad!" Tommy hollered, bouncing on his toes. "That snake from the creek, it came to me in a dream last night. Said thanks for saving it and gave me this." He thrust the basin forward, grinning ear to ear. It's special, Dad, I swear. Duke glanced over, one eyebrow cocked, still flipping bacon in the skillet. He took the basin from Tommy's hands, turning it over like it was some yard sale trinket. This old thing, he grunted. Looks like something a hobo ditched in a ditch. Ain't nothing special about it, kid. With a shrug, he tossed it onto a pile of junk in the corner, old pots, a busted lantern, and went back to his cooking. Tommy's face fell, but he didn't argue. Duke was stubborn as a mule when he made up his mind. Fast forward a couple days. Duke was out back, getting ready to wash some potatoes they'd scrounged from a neighbor's garden. He grabbed a bucket, but in a clumsy misstep, typical Duke, he tripped over a root and smashed it against a rock. Dang it, he cursed, kicking the shards. Now he was stuck, rummaging through the cabin for something else to use. That's when his eyes landed on Tommy's beat-up basin, gathering dust in the corner. Might as well, he muttered, snagging it without a second thought. Duke hauled the basin to the creek, dunked it in to rinse off the grime, and started scrubbing those spuds. But then, hold your horses, something freaky happened. The water in the basin didn't just sit there, it kept rising, sloshing over the edges like a busted faucet. Duke blinked, rubbed his eyes, figuring he'd had one too many beers the night before. He shook it off and tossed in the potatoes, 3 measly ones to start. Except a minute later, that basin was overflowing with spuds, piled high like he'd raided a whole field. He stared, slack-jawed, then tossed in a couple strips of bacon from breakfast. Boom, next thing he knew, the basin was brimming with sizzling strips, enough to feed a lumber camp. Duke's brain finally caught up. Holy smokes, he whispered, this thing's for real. He scooped up the basin and bolted inside, hollering, Tommy, get over here, quick. Tommy ran in, and Duke shoved the basin at him. Tell me exactly what that snake said, kid, every word. Tommy scrunched his face, thinking hard. It said thanks for saving it, gave me the basin, and told me to keep doing good so things get better. Duke let out a booming laugh, slapping his knee. Well, I'll be. Good deeds. Duke Vaughn was still cackling like a madman, clutching the copper basin like it was a winning lottery ticket. Good deeds pay off, huh? He said, eyes gleaming. Let's test this baby out. He fished a crumpled dollar bill from his pocket, last of his scratch-off cash, and dropped it into the basin. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, like some hillbilly magic trick, the basin rattled and filled up with crisp greenbacks, spilling over the sides. Duke hooped, scooping up fistfuls of cash. Tommy, you little genius, we're rich. Overnight, the Vaughns went from scraping by to swimming in dough. Duke didn't waste time. He packed up their rickety cabin, loaded Tommy and his wife, Mary Vaughn, into a beat-up pickup, and hightailed it out of the Appalachian Hollow. They landed in Knoxville, a bustling little city with brick buildings and honking cars, a far cry from their dirt road days. First thing Duke did was hire a fancy doctor for Mary, who'd been battling a cough that wouldn't quit since Tommy was born. With daily checkups and proper meds, she started perking up, color creeping back into her cheeks. The Vaughns settled into a big house on the edge of town, 2 stories, white picket fence, the whole American dream deal. Word spread fast about Duke's sudden fortune. He was a tall guy, broad-shouldered, with a decent mug to boot, and soon enough, the Knoxville socialites came sniffing around. Women in sundresses and pearls started batting their lashes, offering to be Mrs. Vaughn number 2. But Duke wasn't having it. I've got my Mary and my boy, he'd say, waving them off. That's all the family I need. Loyal as a hound dog, that man. Still, money changes things. The Vaughn's new life wasn't all smooth sailing. Late one night, rain hammering the roof, they were tucked in bed when a loud knock rattled the front door. Duke grumbled, pulling on a flannel robe, and shuffled downstairs. He swung the door open to find a soaked stranger, a wiry guy in a tailored coat, looking like he'd stepped out of a gangster flick. Next to him stood a little girl, maybe 8, shivering under a hood. Evening, Mr. Vaughn, the man said, voice slick as oil. Mind if we come in? Got nowhere else to go in this storm. Duke's gut twisted, something about the guy felt off, but he wasn't the type to turn folks away. Yeah, all right, he said, stepping aside. Get in before you catch your death. Mary hustled downstairs with blankets, wrapping up the pair. The man introduced himself as Ray Tanner, a traveling salesman down on his luck, and the girl as his daughter, Ellie. They looked pitiful, dripping on the hardwood, and Duke figured he'd done his good deed for the day. Little did he know that Basin's magic had drawn more than just money to their door. Duke Vaughn couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as Ray Tanner and little Ellie settled into the guest room that stormy night. Ray had a salesman's charm, smooth talk, quick grins, but his eyes darted too much, like he was casing the joint. Ellie, though, was quiet, clinging to her dad's coat, her big eyes scanning the house. Mary, ever the soft touch, fussed over them, bringing hot cocoa and extra quilts. "Poor things, out in that mess," she said, patting Ellie's damp hair. Duke just nodded, figuring they'd be gone by morning. Next day, Ray spun a sob story over breakfast, pancakes dripping with syrup, courtesy of Mary. "Lost everything on a bad deal," he said, fork hovering. "Me and Ellie been drifting ever since. You folks saved us." Duke, still wary, softened a bit. "Well, stay till the rain lets up," he offered. "We've got room." Big mistake. Ray took it as an open invite, and soon he and Ellie were fixtures, eating at the table, lounging on the porch, acting like they owned the place. Mary didn't mind at first. She'd always wanted a bigger family, and Ellie's shy smiles warmed her up. But after a week, she started noticing things. Ray'd sidle up to Duke whenever he could, chatting him up about business, money, the works. Duke, usually gruff, started hanging on Ray's every word, laughing too loud, nodding like a bobblehead. Mary caught Ray slipping Duke a sly wink once, and it made her skin crawl. Then came the night that flipped everything upside down. Duke was in the bathroom, scrubbing off a day's sweat, while Mary put Tommy to bed. He'd been under the weather, coughing like his mom used to. She hurried to check on Duke, but the door wouldn't budge. Frowning, she peeked through the keyhole. There, under the flickering bulb, was Duke, shirtless, grinning, and Ray pressed close, whispering something. Mary's heart sank. She banged on the door, but no answer. When it finally creaked open, Duke stumbled out, eyes glassy, and Ray smirked like he'd won a bet. "Just talking, Mary," Duke mumbled, brushing past her. From then on, Duke wasn't himself. He'd snap at Mary over nothing, burnt toast, a creaky floorboard, while Ray hovered, all smiles and soft words. Mary confronted Ray one evening, cornering him in the kitchen. "What did you do to my husband?" she demanded. Ray just chuckled, leaning against the counter. "Me? I'm a guest, Mary. You're the one who let us in. Family takes care of family, right?" His tone dripped with mockery, and Mary's blood ran cold. A few days later, it got weirder. Mary caught her reflection in a spoon. Her face looked wrong. Her sharp cheekbones softened, her brown eyes turned gray, like Ray's. She dropped the spoon, gasping, and ran to a mirror. Staring back was Ray's face, smug and strange. Meanwhile, Ray strutted out of the guest room, and Lord help her, he looked like her, down to the freckles on her nose. Even his voice mimicked hers, sweet and lilting. Duke didn't blink twice, calling Ray Mary like nothing was off. The real Mary screamed, but no one listened, except Tommy, who watched it all with wide, knowing eyes. Mary Vaughn was a wreck. Her own face, her face was gone, replaced by Ray Tanner's smirking mug every time she caught a glimpse in the glass. Worse, Duke treated Ray like he was her, cooing over Mary, while barking at the real her like she was some freeloading stranger. She tried reasoning with him one night, voice shaking. "Duke, it's me, your wife, Tommy's mom. That man's a liar." But Duke just sneered, "Quit your yapping, Ray. I took you in out of pity, and this is how you repay me? Stirring trouble." He shoved her toward the door, and a gaggle of housemaids, hired with the Basin's cash, dragged her out into the Knoxville night. Tommy, 12 now and sharp as a tack, saw it all from the stairs. His mom's pleas cut him deep, and when Ray sauntered by, wearing Mary's face like a cheap Halloween mask, Tommy's fists clenched. He bolted after Mary, finding her slumped on the curb, rain soaking her through. "Mom!" he cried, throwing his arms around her. She hugged him tight, tears mixing with the downpour. "Tommy, listen," she rasped. "That man, he's no good. You've got to watch out for your dad, peel the scales off their eyes. I can't come back till it's fixed." "Where you going?" Tommy asked, voice cracking. Mary forced a smile. "Back to the old cabin, where we started. You be strong, okay?" She squeezed his hand and trudged off into the dark, leaving Tommy alone with a fire in his gut. He knew Ray was bad news, Ellie too, but everyone else in the house acted like Ray was Mary. Even the neighbors called him Mrs. Vaughn, without a second glance. Tommy tried telling Duke the truth, over and over, but his dad just ruffled his hair and laughed it off. "You've got an imagination, kid." Weeks passed, and Ray tightened his grip. Duke, still blind, took Ray's advice to start a trucking business, heading out of town with a fat stack of basin cash. With him gone, Ray turned on Tommy. One day he banished the kid to the attic. "You're in the way, boy," swapping Tommy's clean clothes for ragged hand-me-downs. Meals went from steak to stale bread, and Ray's grin grew meaner. Tommy gritted his teeth, remembering Mary's words. He'd play along, figure out what Ray and Ellie were after. Late one night, Tommy woke to creaking floorboards. Peeking through the attic hatch, he saw Ray and Ellie sneaking toward his old room, carrying a candle that threw long shadows. They leaned over his empty bed, and Ray muttered, "Time to finish him." Ellie nodded, pulling a small vial from her pocket, something dark and oily. They blew a faint mist into the air, a sickly sweet stench wafting up. Tommy held his breath, heart pounding, and felt a weird tingle, like the stuff couldn't touch him. Ellie hissed, "It didn't work again. What's with this kid?" Ray growled, "If he won't bend, he's gotta go. He's the only one who sees us." They stormed off, and Tommy sat up, mind racing. They wanted the basin's wealth, and him out of the picture. Tommy Vaughn lay awake in the attic, the moon slicing through a cracked window pane. Ray and Ellie's words echoed in his head. They wanted him gone, and the basin's riches for themselves. He clutched the copper basin, hidden under a pile of old blankets. They didn't know he'd kept it close, not trusting Ray's sticky fingers. "You're my ace, aren't ya?" he whispered to it, tracing its dents. If they were coming for him, he'd be ready. Next morning, Ray barked orders like he owned the place. "Tommy, get down to the creek and wash these clothes," he snapped, tossing a sack of grimy laundry. Tommy squinted. Ray's tone had an edge, like he was itching for an excuse. "Sure thing," Tommy said, playing dumb, and grabbed the basin instead of the usual bucket. He trudged to the creek behind the Knoxville house, the same spot where he'd saved that rattler years back. Today it was dead quiet, no birds, no breeze, just the water gurgling over rocks. He knelt by the bank, dunking shirts into the basin, keeping one eye on the woods. Something felt wrong. The sky darkened fast, clouds rolling in like a storm on steroids. Thunder rumbled, and the creek churned, waves lapping higher than they should have. Tommy Scoot screamed trap. Then it hit. Icy hands grabbed his ankles from the water, yanking him toward the depths. He thrashed, gripping the basin, but those unseen claws were strong, dragging him under. The creek turned into a whirlpool, swallowing him whole. Tommy kicked and flailed, lungs burning, until the basin flared up. Bam! A golden glow burst from it, wrapping him like a shield. The hands let go, and he shot to the surface, gasping. Huddled on the muddy bank, he saw Ray and Ellie stroll up, smug as sin. "No splash, no scream," Ellie said, peering at the now calm water. "He's fish food." Ray smirked. "Good riddance. Now it's ours, me as Mary, you as Tommy. Let's clean up the loose ends." They turned and walked off, thinking they'd won. Tommy crawled out, legs wobbly but alive. "Not today, you snakes," he muttered, clutching the basin. He knew where he had to go, back to the old cabin to Mary. It took hours, hiking through briars and back roads, but he found her chopping wood outside their Appalachian shack. "Tommy!" she cried, dropping the axe. He spilled everything: Ray's plot, the creek, the basin's save. Mary's face hardened. "They want our money? Let him try. We'll take it all back." She grabbed his hand. "We're going to Old Man Harper's place. He knows things, folk stuff. If Ray's pulling tricks, Harper'll know how to fight him." Tommy nodded, basin tucked under his arm. They had a war to win, and he wasn't about to let Ray steal his family, or his life. Tommy Vaughn and Mary hustled through the Appalachian dusk, the copper basin banging against Tommy's hip. They reached Old Man Harper's shack, a rickety lean-to stacked with jars of herbs and bones, the kind of place folks whispered about. Harper was a wiry geezer, white beard down to his chest, eyes sharp like a hawk's. "Well, if it ain't little Tommy Vaughn," he rasped, puffing a corncob pipe. "What's got you and your ma riled up?" Mary laid it out, the face swap, Ray's hold on Duke, the creek attack. Harper listened, nodding slow, then spat into a tin can. Sounds like a skinwalker's work, or close to it, he said. Ain't human, that Ray. I reckon he's a fox, sly one too. 'Bout a month back, I tangled with a white-furred critter in the woods. Talked like a man, ran off when I swung my axe. Bet it's your guest. Tommy's jaw tightened. A fox? How do we stop it? Harper rummaged through a trunk, muttering, but before he could answer, a rustle came from the trees. Tommy spun, heart thumping, and saw it, a snake long as a fence post, with two heads weaving side to side. Mary flinched, but Tommy froze. It felt familiar, like that rattler from years ago. Benefactor, it hissed, voices overlapping, you're in deep. That fox'll fool 'em all till you're dust. Take this, shine it on him when the time's right. One head dropped a scratched-up hand mirror into the dirt, then the snake slithered off, gone in a blink. They didn't waste time. With the mirror in hand, Tommy and Mary raced back to Knoxville, spurred by a fake telegram Ray had sent, claiming Duke was dead. Bursting through the front door, they found Duke alive, pacing the porch, furious. "Tommy, you got that basin," he roared. "Hand it over, you ungrateful runt. I raised you, and you run off with some tramp?" He jabbed a finger at Mary, still wearing Ray's face. Tommy squared up, chest heaving. "Dad, look at him, really look. Who's your wife?" Duke didn't hesitate, pointing at Ray, who stood smug in Mary's stolen skin. "Enough games," Tommy growled. He whipped out the mirror and aimed it at Ray. The glass flashed, and Ray shrieked, clawing at his face as he hit the ground. His features melted, Mary's freckles twisting into a white fox's snout, gray eyes glowing feral. Ellie yelped and bolted, but the jig was up. Duke blinked, like waking from a bad dream, as the house shimmered, illusions fading. "Mary!" he croaked, seeing her real face snap back. Ray the fox snarled, then scampered off, tail between its legs. Mary grabbed Duke's arm, tears streaking. "It's me, you big lug." Duke crumpled, guilt hitting hard. "I kicked you out, believe that thing," she shushed him. "We're together now." Tommy pulled the basin from his coat, but its glow was gone, magic spent. "Snake paid us back 3 times, he said. Guess we're on our own now." Duke sighed, eyeing the empty basin. Tommy grinned. "We don't need it, Dad. Money brought trouble, family's what counts." They sold the Knoxville place, moved back to the cabin, and started fresh. Duke tried trucking again, legit this time, and built a modest life. No fox tricks, just hard work and love. "Hey there, folks," tracing Gwyn back with another wild tale. "This time we're headed to Colonial Virginia, round about 1750, to meet Jack Logan, a fella who'd give you the shirt off his back, even if it left him shivering." Jack hailed from the bustling tobacco town of Williamsburg, where he'd made a tidy fortune growing the stuff and trading it up the coast. Unlike some of those tight-fisted planters, Jack was a softy, always tossing coins to beggars or buying rounds at the tavern. Folks loved him for it, clapping him on the back wherever he went. At 23, Jack tied the knot with Millie Logan, born Millie Turner, a gal so pretty she could stop a horse mid-gallop. She had a smile sweeter than molasses and a way of talking that'd charm the bark off a tree. But here's the catch. Millie had a mean streak when it came to money, especially with the help. Jack ran a big plantation house, cooks, maids, field hands, and before Millie came along, he paid him fair, even generous. 3 shillings a month, steady as clockwork. Then Millie swept in, and oh boy, did things change. She took one look at the payroll and declared, "We're bleeding silver." Next thing you know, she slashed wages to a measly shilling, calling it room and board fees. Jack hated it, his heart sank seeing the workers' faces drop, but Millie had him wrapped around her finger. "They've got a roof and stew," she'd say, batting her lashes. "What's the fuss?" He'd grumble but cave, slipping extra coins to the hands behind her back to ease his conscience. Word got around, of course. The workers cornered Jack one day, hats in hand, begging him to set things right. "Mr. Logan, you're a good man," they said. "Can't you talk to the missus?" Jack, red-faced, promised he'd try. He went to Millie, pleading their case, but she lit into him like a thunderstorm. "You're soft as mush, Jack Logan," she hollered, then stormed off to her folks' place in Jamestown for 3 days, leaving him to stew. When she came back, Jack groveled, via her pa, no less, vowing to toe her line. Millie smirked, satisfied, and the workers' meals shrank from roast pork to thin gruel, meat doled out once a fortnight like it was gold dust. Jack's heart ached, but he kept quiet, until trouble came knocking. Summer of '51 rolled in hot and wet to Williamsburg, and one July, the skies opened up something fierce. 3 days of rain pounded Jack Logan's plantation, turning the fields to muck and the big house into a leaky mess. The roof sagged, walls cracked, and a couple outbuildings looked ready to collapse. Jack scratched his head, figuring it was high time to fix things proper. "Can't have the place falling on our heads," he told Millie. So he rounded up 7 or 8 carpenters from town, rough-handed fellas with saws and hammers, ready to patch up the Logan estate. With the job being a big one, the carpenters bunked down in the barn, eating their meals at Jack's table. He saw how hard they worked, sweating through the heat, hauling timber till dusk, and it tugged at his soft spot. Over supper one night, gruel and a scrap of bacon for the hands, he pulled Millie aside. "These boys are busting their backs," he said. "How's about we give 'em proper grub? White bread, maybe 2 pounds of pork a day." Millie's eyes narrowed, lips pursing like she'd bit a lemon. "Proper grub," she snapped. "Our own folks toil just as hard, and they're lucky to see meat twice a month. You want to spoil these strangers, make 'em think they're better than the rest." Jack rubbed his neck, trying to keep the peace. "Millie, they're here 'cause we need 'em. Word is, carpenters know tricks, old trade secrets from some fella named Luban. Cross 'em, and they'll hex your house. I ain't risking that for a few scraps of pork." Millie rolled her eyes, but that Luban bit stuck. She'd heard whispers, tall tales about craftsmen cursing beams to creak or doors to jam if you stiffed 'em. "Fine," she huffed, "bread and pork it is. But don't go crying when the pantry's bare." Jack grinned, relieved, and slipped a quiet word to the cook, old Bess. "Add an extra 2 pounds of meat to the pot," he said, winking. "Sneak some to the hands, too, Millie don't need to know." Bess chuckled, shaking her head. "You're a saint, Mr. Jack, but a fool for that wife o' yours. We owe you plenty." The carpenters dug into their hearty meals, steaming bread, juicy pork, and worked like mules, grateful for the spread. One young un, a wiry kid they called Stutter 'cause of his shaky tongue, went at it hardest, hammering from dawn till dark, barely stopping to sip water. Jack watched him, chest swelling a little. "Good folks deserve good treatment," he muttered, hoping Millie'd come around. But deep down, he knew she'd never see it his way, not yet anyhow. By late August, the carpenters had worked wonders on Jack Logan's plantation. The roof was tight, the walls sturdy, and the outbuildings stood proud again, good as new under Williamsburg's blazing sun. It had taken a solid month, and those boys earned every blister. Jack figured it was time to settle up, so he called them to the porch, promising 4 shillings apiece, fair pay for honest sweat. They'd stuck around, trusting his word, and he aimed to keep it. Enter Millie Logan, storming in like a hornet with a grudge. She'd been eyeballing the cash box, and when Jack handed over the wages, she snatched it back. "Half's plenty," she declared, doling out 2 shillings each instead. "You ate my bread, slept under my roof. Don't that count for something?" The carpenters grumbled, faces darkening. Jack's stomach dropped. "Millie, I gave him my word 4 shillings, he argued, voice rising. "You're making me a liar, bad business for a man like me." Millie crossed her arms, unflinching. "Business? They've been stuffing their gullets for 30 days, pork, bread, the lot. That's 2 shillings worth, easy. They oughta thank us." Jack gripped the porch rail, knuckles white. "What about Luban's tricks? You want to risk a curse over a couple coins?" She scoffed, tossing her hair. "Work's done, house looks fine, I checked it myself. What are they gonna do now? Hex a nail loose?" Jack opened his mouth, but Millie's logic, twisted as it was, tied his tongue. She marched out to the carpenters, head high. "Take your 2 shillings and be glad," she barked. "Room and board ain't free. Make a fuss, and I'll haul you to the magistrate. My uncle's the deputy governor, you know." That shut him up quick. The fellas knew Deputy Governor Turner, Millie's kin, and didn't fancy tangling with him. Stutter, the young un, clenched his fists but said nothing. They pocketed the coins, muttering curses under their breath, and trudged off, tails between their legs. Millie sashayed back inside, smug as a cat with a canary, and bragged to Jack's folks, old Ma and Pa Logan, about saving the family a pretty penny. They nodded, impressed, clapping her on the back.
Sharpless, pachkald.
Jack, though, slumped in a rocker, staring at the horizon. He'd seen the hurt in those carpenters' eyes, Stutter's most of all, and it gnawed at him. Shoulda stood my ground, he muttered, but Millie's glare kept him quiet. Trouble was brewing, and he could feel it in his bones. A few weeks after the carpenters left, Jack Logan hit the road with his trusty manservant, Tom too, hauling tobacco to sell in the next county. They rattled along in a creaky wagon, dust kicking up under the Virginia sun, when a sharp wail cut through the air. Jack yanked the reins, peering into the roadside brush. There an old woman, hair gray as ash, was thrashing at the weeds with a stick, sobbing like her world had ended. "Tom, hold up," Jack said, hopping down. "Ma'am, what's wrong?" She looked up, eyes red and raw. "My boy, my poor stammering boy," she choked out. "Learned carpentry, worked hard, but it weren't enough. Hung himself last night." Jack's gut twisted. "Stammering boy?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Aye," she said. "Folks called him Stutter. Got a job at some big house, Logan Place, they said. Promised 4 shillings, but came back with 2. Needed 8 for a bride, see. Couldn't scrape it together, and she left him. Took a rope to the barn." Jack felt the blood drain from his face. Stutter, his Stutter, dead over 2 measly shillings. The old woman kept on, "Got no money for a coffin, so I'm weaving grass to bury him." "Oh, my boy," Jack's knees buckled, but he steadied himself. "I'm so sorry," he managed, pulling 2 shillings from his pocket, his last coins, and pressing them into her hand. "For the burial." He didn't dare say he was that Logan. Back in the wagon, he told Tom, "Keep this quiet," then turned the horses around, hightailing it to town. He bought a pine coffin and had it sent to Stutter's ma, anonymous-like, her thanks ringing in his ears as he fled. Tom rode beside him, grim. "Hard times all round, sir," he said. "My own ma and little brother, they're starving since Millie cut our pay. Used to send 'em enough to eat, but now," Jack clenched the reins. "This is on me, Tom. I let her do it." Guilt chewed him raw. Stutter's death, Tom's kin going hungry, all cause Millie wouldn't bend. "I'll fix it," he swore. "Starting with you, every shilling she took, I'll slip back to you quiet-like. Then we're finding the others." Tom's eyes lit up, and he threw himself into the hunt. By noon, they tracked down a carpenter named Chuck, one of Stutter's crew. Jack handed over the missing 2 shillings, head bowed. "I'm sorry about what my wife did," he said. Chuck's family dropped to their knees, thanking him, and word spread. One by one, Jack found the rest, 6 more carpenters, returning their wages with apologies. They blessed him, tears flowing, but back home, Millie noticed the cashbox lighter. She lit into him, screaming till the rafters shook, then stormed off to Jamestown again, trunk stuffed with coins. Jack's folks scolded him, "Fetch her back, you fool." But this time, he didn't budge. Enough was enough. Millie Logan stayed gone a good 10 days, holed up at her folks' place in Jamestown, stewing over Jack's handouts to the carpenters. When she finally strutted back to the Williamsburg plantation, trunk in tow, Jack welcomed her with open arms, still smitten despite the fights. He'd taken the cashbox reins while she was away, but handed them back to keep the peace. Millie smirked, thinking she'd won, and settled in like nothing changed. But a few days later, her tune shifted. It started with whining, loud, daily gripes about the heat, the maids, Jack's soft heart. Then she got quiet, too quiet. One morning, Jack found her slumped in bed, pale as a ghost, scratching at her arms. "Look at me," she wailed, holding up hands dotted with angry red spots. They crept up her neck, her face, little welts like she'd rolled in poison ivy. Jack's stomach sank. "I'll fetch Doc Grayson," he said, bolting for town. The doctor poked and prodded, prescribed tonics and salves, but nothing worked. 3 docs later, the spot stayed, and Millie's temper flared worse than ever. "I've cursed us," she moaned one night, clutching a quilt. "Something's wrong, unnatural. You gotta find a preacher, Jack, or one o' them witch finders." Jack didn't buy into spooks easy, but he loved her enough to try. Word around Williamsburg pointed him to Reverend Micah Holt, a wiry, gray-eyed man known for chasing devils and curing hexes. Folks swore he'd banished a banshee from a mill once, though Jack took it with a grain of salt. He rode out, found Holt at his clapboard chapel, and dragged him back to the plantation. Reverend Holt paced the house, Bible in one hand, a whittled cross in the other, muttering prayers Jack couldn't catch. He stopped by Millie's bedside, squinting at her spots. "You had carpenters here, didn't ya?" he asked, voice low. Jack nodded. "I fixed the place after the rains." Holt frowned. "And you crossed 'em, I reckon, short-changed 'em?" Millie, weak but sharp, rasped, "I paid what they deserved." Jack winced, spilling the truth. "She cut their wages, Reverend. I tried to fix it later, but—" Holt clicked his tongue, circling the room. "That's it, then. Carpenter's got an old trick, Luban's craft, they call it, passed down from some ancient builder. Wrong 'em, and they'll weave a curse into your walls. Them spots? Bad luck's mark." He knelt, tapped the doorframe's threshold, a thick oak slab, and said, "Here's your trouble. They've hexed this. Tear it out, burn it in the woodpile, and we'll see." Jack stared, half-doubting, but Millie's panicked eyes begged him to act. "Do it, Jack," she croaked. "I ain't dying over 2 shillings." Jack Logan didn't waste a second. "Tom, too," he hollered, grabbing an axe from the shed. "Help me rip this threshold out." Reverend Micah Holt stood by, cross in hand, as Jack and Tom hacked at the oak slab under Millie's bedroom door. Splinters flew, and Millie watched from her bed, scratching her spots and muttering prayers. They hauled the wood to the yard, tossed it on the woodpile, and set it ablaze. Flames licked high, smoke curling into the Virginia dusk, and Holt nodded. "That's step 1, he said. "Now, I'll fetch something to finish it." He rode off, returning an hour later with a pouch of dried leaves. Smelled like sage and something bitter. "Boil this into tea," Holt instructed. "She drinks it, and them spots'll fade. But mark me, this only patches the symptoms. To break the curse for good, she's gotta change her ways. Good deeds, no more meanness, or it'll come back worse." Jack relayed it to Millie, loud and clear. "Hear that? Good deeds, darlin', no more skimping." She nodded, frantic. "I'll do it, I swear. Just make it stop." Jack brewed the tea, and Millie gulped it down, wincing at the taste. Next morning, miracle of miracles, her spots were gone, skin smooth as a babe's. She bounced out of bed, energy back, and threw her arms around Jack. "That preacher's a saint," she crowed. From then on, she flipped like a coin, handing out bread to the hands, slipping coins to beggars, even thanking old Bess with a smile. Jack watched, grinning, while Tom too shot him a knowing thumbs up from the kitchen. Turns out, there was more to it. A week later, Holt swung by, pulling Jack aside. "No curse, Jack," he whispered. "Them carpenters didn't hex squat, Luban's just a yarn. Millie's spots? A little trick I cooked up." Jack's jaw dropped. "What?" Holt smirked. "Slipped you some itchweed powder for she came back, colorless, tasteless. Docs couldn't fix it, but my tea did. Knew she'd believe a hex, so we played her. You wanted her kind, didn't ya?" Jack laughed, clapping Holt's shoulder. "You sly dog. I owe you one." Tom too'd been in on it too, fetching Holt after Jack begged for a way to soften Millie's heart. The fake curse worked like a charm. Millie stayed generous, and word spread round Williamsburg. When war hit years later, redcoats and all, the Logan's place stood untouched, folks guarding it like kin. Jack and Millie lived past 90, gray and happy, their kindness paying off. "Good beats gold," Jack'd say, and Millie'd nod, her old stinginess a ghost long gone.